Well, g'day folks, thank you for joining me roadside today for another weekly tutorial in our Chronological Bible Reading Plan. We're reading through the whole Bible in a year, and this is week 48, so we are this close to finishing off, and this is a big week of readings coming up. I know you're going to enjoy. We're doing a few things. We're reading 4 of Paul's minor epistles, okay, his smaller letters, and also, notably, we are finishing off the book of Acts. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the narrative, step back and understand the storyline of what we're reading, and then I'll finish off giving you 3 things I want you to pay attention to as you read through Paul's preaching and Paul's letters this week. Okay, so here we go. We're picking up this week in the narrative in Acts chapter 20. Paul is on his 3rd ministry trip, going back to Jerusalem with another financial gift for the struggling churches down there. And as he's heading there, he becomes fully aware that trouble is about to face him. After all, he's facing troubles by religious Jews everywhere he goes, but Jerusalem is the headquarters, okay, of all the animosity and opposition that's coming against him. Well, he's not perturbed by that. He heads straight to Jerusalem, goes to the temple, and a riot ensues. And so, of course, because there's a riot, he has to appear before the local court. So he does that. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, and the Roman commanders see him there in Jerusalem, much like they did with Jesus. But note this, unlike Jesus, Paul is a Roman citizen. Okay, that's a special status that Paul has, probably through his father somewhere. We don't really know. But what that means is that when he goes through that trumped up trial there in Jerusalem, he has the ability as a Roman citizen to appeal his case to a higher court. And he does that. And that takes him to a place called Caesarea, which is basically the Roman capital of that whole area. Jerusalem was the Jewish capital, but Caesarea was the political Roman capital. Anyway, he heads up there. He gets stuck there in the court system, basically, for 2 years, all right, until eventually his appeal process takes him all the way to the Supreme Court, so to speak, in Rome. And so here we are. Paul ends up, just like he wanted to, kind of, in Rome, in the political capital of the Roman world. Jesus, at the start of the book of Acts, said, I want you to be my witnesses to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world, or the end of the land. Well, there he is in Rome. It is the center of the civilized world of the day. And Paul is stuck there in Rome for 2 years, AD 60 to 62, while he awaits his trial there, okay? And that's why some of us believe that Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, who the book of Acts is written to, is part of Paul's defense team. This is why Luke's writing to him, to give him Paul's story. How did Paul end up in Rome? Why is this man appealed all the way to the highest court in the land? Well, here is his story, and there in Acts 28, the book of Acts abruptly ends with Paul there under house arrest, okay? So there you go. There is the book of Acts. Now, what happens next? Well, this is where we need to read the epistles, okay? It turns out that while he's there in Rome, he leads a young man to Christ called Onesimus. And it turns out Onesimus is a runaway slave from Colossae, and his slave owner is a friend of Paul, a guy called Philemon, okay? So Paul convinces Onesimus, mate, you need to go back to your slave owner. It's not right that you have run away. It's illegal, and if I'm harboring you, I could also get in trouble as well, and I can't have that while I'm in Rome, right? So what he does is he says, mate, you go back to Colossae, go to Philemon, own up to your mistake, and by the way, while you go, take this letter with you. Don't open it. It's to Philemon. I'm writing him a letter because he's a friend of mine. Take this letter with you, and that's how we get the book of Philemon. But then Paul thinks, you know what? I might as well write to the churches in that area and have you deliver more letters on your way. After all, it's been 4 or 5 years since I wrote to the Romans. Okay, I'm due to write again. I'm just sitting here in prison after all doing nothing. So he writes 3 church letters for Onesimus to take with him and to deliver on his way. He writes to the Colossians, where Philemon lives. He's never been there, Paul, but he writes to them anyway. He writes to the Ephesians, good friend of Paul's, spent 2 years there, so he writes them a letter. And then he also writes to the church in Laodicea. Okay, now you might think, well, I've never heard of the Laodiceans letter. Well, that's because we don't have it, all right? It wasn't preserved for us. We don't have it in the Bible. It doesn't exist, all right? But he wrote it anyway. You're going to find out this week. And that's why Colossians and Ephesians are really similar. They're written at the same time, delivered by hand by the same person, written to churches in the same region of Asia, and they follow a very, very similar pattern. They were designed to be shared amongst other churches, and so that's one of the reasons you're going to read Colossians and then Ephesians and think, whoa, they're a bit similar. Exactly, they are, and that sort of explains why. Okay, so there you go. So we've got Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians. And off he goes, Onesimus goes down to Philemon to deliver the letters, and then a guy rocks up called Epaphroditus, knocks on Paul's door there in Rome, and says, "G'day mate, I've come from Philippi with a financial gift from the church there to help you. They heard that you're in chains, and I've come to be a support to you." Well, Paul is so grateful for that. He loves the Philippian church. Remember Lydia, and a seller of purple cloth, and the prison doors that shook? That's Philippi, okay? So he writes them a thank you letter and sends Epaphroditus back to deliver it. So there you go. That's how we get Philemon, Colossians and Ephesians, and then finally Philippians. That is what you are reading this week. And I want you to do it in 4 sittings, okay? Read the book of Acts, 20 to 28, then read Philemon and Colossians together, because they're basically written to the same church community, then Ephesians, and then finish off with Philippians, all right? You do that, you'll get through your readings and understand the big story and how they all work together just nicely, okay? Easy. Last 3 things to finish with that I want you to pay attention to as you do your readings this week. The first thing that I noticed this week, and I haven't mentioned this for quite a while, so pay attention, is the whole issue of the afterlife. Okay, I mentioned this months ago when we were reading through the Old Testament and Job and Genesis and that type of thing. Well, it stood out to me again this week. Why? Because Paul is facing the high prospect of death, and he doesn't seem to mind. In fact, he writes to the Philippians, chapter 1, I think it is, and says, "For me, if I die, that's to my benefit, because I get to be with Christ." Now listen, the reason that this stood out to me is because it's so different to how David saw death in the Psalms. Remember when David was about to die and Saul was after him and all this stuff was happening, and he said, "The cords of Sheol were about to entangle me. I cried out for deliverance because I didn't want to go to death. I didn't want to go to Sheol." Paul, he's happy to go. Why? Because he's not going to the same place. Jesus has obviously affected what happens in the afterlife, and so Paul's outlook on death is very different to Old Testament saints. Take a note of that. Second thing I want you to notice is something I spent a lot of time on last week, is the us and you, Jew and Gentile way that Paul writes. You're going to notice this particularly in Ephesians, where he starts by saying, we were predestined, we were chosen, we were adopted, we were loved by God, and we were the first to hope in Christ. Who's he talking about? We Jews were the first to hope in Christ, and then you were also included when you heard the gospel. You were dead in sins, but God has raised you to life and seated with him in heavenly places. So again, the us and you thing comes out really strong. And this week, the whole Jew and Gentile as one theology is really focused on by Paul. In fact, he calls Jew and Gentile coming together in one body as a mystery, an eternal mystery that was kept hidden for ages and generations, but has now been revealed. So pay attention to the word mystery, because you're going to see it, I think, a dozen times this week, just in Colossians and Ephesians, a Jew and Gentile churches when he writes to them. Okay. Last thing, of course, I want you to pay attention to is how the Old Testament scriptures are referenced constantly here in the New. When Paul is on trial and he gets up to make his defense, he says, listen, all I'm doing is preaching the law and the prophets. That's all I'm doing. I'm not making up a new theology, okay? I'm just saying that what the law and the prophets promised is now, today, being fulfilled. When he writes to the Colossians, he says, listen, the Hebrew style of worship and sacrifice is all about shadows. Jesus is the substance to those shadows. When he writes to the Ephesians and he says, you guys are God's bride, his family, his body, his army, all these pictures are pictures that we find in the Old Testament when they spoke about God's old covenant community. Well, Paul applies them here to the new. And in Philippians chapter 2, Philippians, there's only one place I noticed where Paul quotes the Old Testament, and it's him quoting Moses. This is interesting. Moses, remember, just before he died, sung a prophetic song, Deuteronomy 32, and it was really depressing, okay? It was all about how Israel would have a really bad, disobedient future, and that God eventually would bring an end to the old covenant community when he said, "You are no longer my children, you are a wicked and depraved or crooked generation." Well, Paul quotes that to these first century Christians there in Philippi when he says to them, "Don't complain, don't be whingers like, the people in the desert were, but I need you to shine like stars amongst a wicked and crooked generation." That generation that Moses prophesied was alive in Paul's day. He agrees with what Peter said right at the start of Acts and the day of Pentecost when Peter got up and quoted the exact same verse and said to the Jews there in Jerusalem at the temple, "Save yourselves from this corrupt generation." It reminds me of Jesus all through the Gospels who spoke about this wicked and crooked and depraved and unbelieving generation. Well, it's the first time we've seen the word generation mentioned for quite a while, and it's the first and only quote in Philippians from the Old Testament. That is what Paul chooses to quote, which kind of means, amongst all the good news, it is a reminder from Paul that the day of the Lord promised by Daniel and other Malachi and other prophets toward the end of the Old Testament, where God would bring an end to the Old Covenant era. That's good news, but also then the Old Covenant community would have its final generation. Paul agrees with Peter that this is the day, this is the generation where that is taking place. All right, so keep a note out for that. And as I said to you before, if you have the time, hyperlink whenever you see a quote back to where it was originally written and see whether you can make sense of why the apostles are doing that. All right, enjoy your readings this week, guys. We've got our final week with Paul next week. But before then, this week, read the book of Acts 20 to 28, Philemon and Colossians together, then Ephesians, then Philippians. It's a very happy book, okay? It's a rejoicing book, so I hope you enjoy it. Bless you heaps. I'll see you next week as we finish the life of Paul. Bye.